On August the 13th, 2020, the Scottish Sun ran a controversial headline referring to ScotRail's regular morning train from Aberdeen to Glasgow as the Death Express. The headline may have been sensational, but it wasn't entirely baseless. In fact, 3 lives had been lost the previous day when a train derailed near Carmont in northeast Scotland. The accident resulted in the UK's first rail fatality since 2007, when 1 life was lost during another derailment near Grayrigg in Cumbria. Although originally thought to be a freak accident, investigations unearthed shocking findings which suggested the disaster could have been avoided. But what exactly happened that day? Let's talk about it. This is the story of the Stonehaven train derailment. In order to understand what happened, we need to look at the area of Carmont and the weather-related issues it has. Carmont is a location near Stonehaven in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. The first recorded weather-related train derailment near Carmont occurred all the way back in 1915. More recently, in 2002, a large portion of the track was nearly washed away during a period of high wind and heavy rain that caused multiple landslides and landslips. In the United Kingdom, government-owned Network Rail is responsible for inspecting, maintaining, and managing the country's extensive network of train tracks. In 2014, a system-wide report found that the Carmont area was particularly prone to landslips and other ground stability issues. Then in early 2020, Britain's Office of Rail and Road noted a spike in trackslide landslips that posed a potential lethal threat to rail traffic in and around Carmont. Later that year, North East Scotland was rocked by storms of such epic proportions that the UK's Met Office issued an amber service weather warning. The warning was intended to let the general public, emergency personnel, and transportation service providers know that hazardous conditions like floods and landslips were likely. In some areas, the deluge was so great that lakes and rivers rose by more than 1.5 metres or 5 feet. Some sources even claimed that North East Scotland received a month's worth of rain in just a few hours, and it wasn't just a local phenomenon. 70 miles or 112 kilometres to the south, the Perth railway station experienced such severe flooding that one of its trains got stranded in nearly a metre of water. Likewise, service on the Glasgow-Edinburgh via Falkirk line was disrupted when a canal bank adjacent to the tracks failed. On the morning of Wednesday, August the 12th, 2020, 2 ScotRail crewmen were preparing to depart from Aberdeen en route to Glasgow, 145 miles or 233 kilometres to the southwest. The train was made up of 4 passenger carriers sandwiched between power cars in the front and back. As usual, the train was scheduled to depart promptly at 6:38 am. 45-year-old driver Brett NICOLA was in the lead power car, while 58-year-old conductor DINNIE made his way through the passenger cars, reassuring travellers that the weather wasn't anything to worry about. However, Donald apparently said to one of the passengers that if the rain got any worse, he wouldn't be particularly upset if the trip got cancelled, and he could go home early for a change. All told, there were just 9 people on the train, far fewer than there would have been if not for a COVID lockdown in Aberdeen. One of the 7 passengers was ScotRail conductor NICOLA WHYTE, who was travelling to Dundee where she was scheduled to work. Shortly after departing, the train was travelling on the double-track main line between Aberdeen and Dundee. Just before 7 am, Brett NICOLA was notified by the signaller at Carmont signal box that another driver had reported a landslip and a line blockage between Carmont and Lawrence Kirk. Unable to proceed any further south, Brett had to stop the train at Carmont. Since the track switch couldn't be initiated remotely, the train remained where it was for approximately 2 hours. Then, finally, a mobile operations manager arrived and carried out the necessary work, which allowed it to move onto a side track and eventually change direction. At about 9:36 am, the train crossed the line and began heading back north towards Aberdeen. Brett asked the signaller if he should reduce speed to account for the unfavourable conditions, but by then, the weather had improved. Since there were no known obstructions or other issues on the northbound track, he was given the OK to proceed at a normal speed. Shortly after reversing direction, the train had accelerated to nearly 73 miles per hour, or 117 kilometers per hour, safely within the line's 75 miles per hour speed limit. But neither Brett nor anyone else knew that a landslip just ahead had caused gravel, soil, and other debris to wash onto and partially cover a portion of the track that the train was rapidly approaching. He did eventually see the obstruction and pulled the emergency brake, but by then, it was far too late to stop the train, and the wheels lost contact with the track when they hit the debris near Carmont just south of Stonehaven. In the third passenger car, a 32-year-old woman first realised there was a serious problem when she heard a horrible metallic grinding sound. Then, the train suddenly felt as if it were floating, a sensation she later likened to a car hydroplaning on a wet road. As the track curved to the right, the train continued onward for approximately 70 metres or 77 yards before slamming into a concrete bridge parapet. The leading power car's momentum propelled it over the bridge, and seconds later, the woman in the third passenger car was ejected through a shattered window. The car she'd been in then toppled down a wooden embankment towards the River Carron below. The third passenger carriage followed. The first passenger carriage turned 90 degrees before coming to a stop, perpendicular to the track. The second overturned and came to the rest on top of the first. The fourth remained upright and attached to the lower of the rear power car. After the crash occurred, one survivor said, "I could see a fire and smell smoke. I became aware very quickly that I was hurt. There was blood over my face from a head wound near my eye. My clothes were all covered in blood, my ears were ringing, so it was hard to make things out." At the time of the incident, contractors had been working on the same bridge over the River Carron. Luckily, they were able to avoid being hit by the derailing carriages and power cars. The crew supervisor immediately called 999 at 9:40 am. Though she sustained multiple injuries, NICOLA WHYTE managed to climb from the wreckage, walk down the track to the nearest line-side telephone, and place a frantic call to Carmont signal box, less than 2 miles away. Shortly after the message was relayed, fire engines, ambulances, and helicopters from multiple agencies began arriving on the scene. First responders immediately set up a makeshift base of operations in a nearby field and began combing through the wreckage. With such a catastrophic scene spread out before them, it seemed unlikely that there would be any survivors. However, 6 passengers with non-life-threatening injuries were rescued and whisked to local hospitals, but sadly, conductor DINNIE, driver Brett McCullough, and a 62-year-old passenger Christopher Stutchberry weren't so lucky and sadly lost their lives. In a particularly sad twist of fate, August 12, 2020 was Christopher Stutchberry's anniversary, and he wasn't even supposed to be on the train in the first place. He only boarded the Aberdeen to Glasgow train because his regular train to Edinburgh had been cancelled. With a little luck, he had hoped he'd be able to make a connection somewhere down the line, so he could spend the evening with his wife, but obviously, he never arrived. Next, work crews began the task of clearing the mangled rail cars and getting the tracks back in working order. Work got underway on September the 10th, but due to the hilly and largely inaccessible terrain around the crash site, workers had to build a 980-yard or 900-metre road to provide access for a monstrous 600-ton tracked crane. However, the machine was delivered in pieces by truck and assembled on site using a smaller crane, all of which took more than a week. In addition, the army provided a heavy tracked recovery vehicle with enough horsepower and traction to drag cars into position so that the crane could lift them. The final carriage was removed from the site on September the 19th, after which Network Rail crews began a number of lengthy repairs. After the recovery, the passenger carriages and power cars were taken to a secure compound in Glasgow, where investigators from the Rail Accident Investigation Branch began gathering physical evidence for the ongoing investigation ahead. With the country still mourning and the public clamouring for answers, the Independent Press Standards organisation received multiple complaints about the Scottish Sun's tasteless headline. Editor Alan Moore formally apologised a few days later, but by then, public attention had shifted towards the more pressing matters, like how such an accident could have happened and what could be done to prevent a similar catastrophe in the future. To those ends, the Crown Office pored over multiple reports from joint investigations carried out by the Scottish Police, the British Transport Police, and the Office of Rail and Road, the independent safety and economic regulator for the country's railways. The investigation found that a drainage system that had been installed nearly a decade earlier by construction management company Carillion wasn't up to the task of coping with the high volume of rain that fell before the crash. As a result, gravel, soil, and other debris washed from the drainage trench onto the track, which in turn caused the train to derail and careen into the bridge parapet. In addition, Network Rail had never had a handover meeting with Carillion or even checked that the drainage system had been constructed properly. The report also found that there had been a number of unaddressed construction issues and safety infractions dating all the way back to 2011. Network Rail were then charged with breaching health and safety laws. At the High Court in Aberdeen, Network Rail pleaded guilty to all charges. Attorneys admitted that the company failed to inspect the drainage system, that the train shouldn't have been permitted to travel at full speed, and that no system had been in place to monitor and analyse incoming weather forecasts. After this, Network Rail was fined £6.7 million, or approximately $8.3 million. Regulators made more than a dozen recommendations which they hoped would improve overall rail safety, but particularly during extended periods of bad weather. As part of the ruling, Network Rail was required to establish 2 entirely new task forces, one to monitor and respond to severe weather conditions, and another to manage and maintain earthworks. A few weeks after the derailment, Prince Charles visited the crash site and thanked emergency personnel for their bravery during the ordeal. Shortly thereafter, NICOLA, WHYTE, and a number of first responders were honoured for their contributions to the search and rescue efforts. But for many, the awards, speeches, and moments of silence could never undo the damage by the derailment. Christopher Stutchberry's widow, Diane, stated that he was just one trip away from retirement, and that on that fateful day, they were robbed of a future together. Another unnamed female survivor left with permanent facial scars and a disfigured shoulder said she no longer trusted Network Rail to keep her safe. In her opinion, the derailment was caused by negligence and therefore could have been avoided. She also said that she felt very lucky to be alive and that the accident changed her life forever. Sadly, 3 years on, lessons haven't really been learned, and many have forecasted an event like this to happen again. Rail, Maritime, and Transport Workers Union leader Mick Lynch said, "Unfortunately, we are faced with a toxic mixture of increasing number of extreme weather events, and government and Network Rail cutting back on railway safety instead of acting on safety recommendations. If the government and Network Rail does not give immediate priority to acting on these safety concerns and recommendations, there is an increased risk of more accidents like Carmont, putting rail workers and rail passengers at risk of harm." Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below. This is not an AI channel, I do all of this myself, the research, writing, editing, thumbnails, etc, and I upload every Thursday. So if you enjoy my work, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.